Hey there everyone, welcome back to the Dan Cave and welcome to another video build, and this time it's a full video build of the Beemax 1/24th scale BMW M3 E30. So this is the Beemax kit that was in the Bastos scheme, although you don't get the Bastos decals in it, and I'm going to build it in the ToughMac scheme of Bertie Fisher from his 1990 Manx International Rally, where he finished second behind Russell Brooks in a Sierra Cosworth. So, Angel Sergio, a few of you may have seen him on eBay, on Facebook. Decal designer, I think he went by on Facebook as well. So he does a lot of decals of rally cars. I did have a look at one of his sets before, wasn't overly keen on the look of it, and because there was an alternate available from Reggie Model, I went with that one. That was on the Manta I built a couple of years ago. But for this one, he had a Bertie Fisher ToughMac scheme. I was always a fan of the ToughMac livery cars of Bertie Fisher. And I thought, there's no alternative. I'm going to have to try them. So I thought this was a good opportunity to try those decals, see how I get on with them. And so yeah, so that's what's going to be built today. So before we dive on into it, I do have a confession to make about it. There is a little bit of a flaw in what I've built. Sadly, the car is left-hand drive. Now, Bertie's car was right-hand drive. Now, I didn't spot this, so when I was doing research on this, it was the same reg number as the Bastos car in the boxing. So I just assumed it stayed as left-hand drive through its entire life. But looking back at the pictures of Bertie actually driving the car, it was actually converted at some point. So yeah, so Bertie actually drove it in a right-hand drive variant. So it was obviously re-prepped, swapped back over. So yeah, so that seems to be a bit of a screw up on my behalf, really. So I was already well into the build. I think the interior was already painted and seatbelts were done and everything, so I decided, no, I'll just stick with it. I can live with it. It's not a showstopper for me. It's clearly a mistake against the reference out there, but then so be it. I can live with it. But however, that's just to warn you in advance before you spot it and you go, oh, that should have been right-hand drive instead of left-hand drive. But there we go. So other than that, I'm going to dive on into the build. But once again, before we jump over, just very, very quickly, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like the video. Feel free to leave a comment down below as well. So let's head on over to the bench and let's see how this full video build of this 1/24th scale BMW M3 E30 goes. So I'll be back at the end for some final thoughts. See you soon. So as already mentioned, I've got the Bastos boxing. I've also got the detail upset and the decals that I mentioned in the intro. So the Bastos boxing has the correct wheels for the ToughMac car, so that's why I've gone with that boxing. The Rothmans one has the BBS wheels from recollection in it. So as is normal for starting the build process, going to start with the body parts. That's mainly things like the body shell itself, the bonnet, front and rear bumpers, and start with cleanup of any seam lines, any sprue attachment points. Sprue attachments can be easily sanded off with a UMP thinning stick. There is moulded in bonnet pins. They're removed with a chisel, and then the remnants removed with the UMP thinning stick once again. There are PE replacements for the bonnet pins. They'll be popped on later in the build process. So there's not many seam lines on this body. It is really, really clean. Just check for them, make sure they're cleaned up properly. There is some pin injection marks on the rear spoiler. A little bit of Humbrol filler sorts them out very, very quickly. So the roof vents can be added. A little bit of Tamiya extra thin, just to put them in place. And then the actual moulded in supports on the body can also be removed and cleaned up. So rear bumpers added. Use some Tamiya white glue on the main attachment points. Slow curing gives plenty of strength and stability. And then once that's in place, I'm going to run some Tamiya extra thin along the inside seam just to make sure that the full extent of the bumper is actually bonded, and then basically follow the same process for the front bumper. So I have actually left the sprue support in for the front end because that will give it some extra strength and stability, and it doesn't interfere with the bonnet. The bonnet itself, of course, is added. There's no engine in this kit, it's curbside, so that bonnet can just be glued in place. So once all that glue is cured, body is then cleaned up, and it's over to the spray booth where it's primed in UMP white primer, all shot through the UMP apex at about 30 psi, and I lay down 3 coats of white primer. So it is white molded plastic, so the white primer goes down absolutely perfectly over the white plastic. No issues with colour compatibility with white. So nice even coats. Try and get good even coverage of that white primer. And then that can be set aside to be cured for about 24 hours. Once it's fully cured, I'm using a Halford's, I think it's a Halford's own brand finishing pad for paintwork. So that just helps remove any dust spots, any high spots in the paintwork, just smooths back that primer finish, and that gives a much better smooth coat for the base color to go on. So the base color is Zero Paint's Pure Brilliant White. And once again, about 3 coats of that are laid down. This time they're shot through the Harder & Steenbeck Infinity Plus, I think it is, with 0.4mm needle, run at about 18 to 20 psi. And again, that's set aside for about 24 hours to cure completely, and then it's time to move on to the decals. So the decals for this kit are basically one full sheet. So every decal has to be completely cut out. It is on a clear backing film, so they are quite translucent, but over the white paint, that'll be absolutely fine. So you need to make sure you trim them accurately, and they do actually fit pretty well to the kit. So it is the usual decal process is going to apply using some warm water, hot air gun, and UMP decal solutions. Now the decals do seem to sit down nicely at this stage. I do run into a few issues later, but nothing very noticeable on the video, but certainly noticeable when I actually go to basically clear coating and polishing the kit. So I might as well speed up the footage of the decals. It's a normal process. Just used warm water to release the decals, a little bit of hot air, UMP decal solutions, get them to set and conform into place. Looking at the issues I have a little bit later, I think they would have benefited using some of the decal fix from UMP or the decal adhesive from Tamiya. I think that would have actually improved the outcome. But however, overall, the decals go down absolutely fine. And because they're on a white background, the fact that they're printed on clear paper with no white backing underneath them, they do sit very, very well. And the colours actually show up pretty good as well. So I'm pretty pleased with the decaling so far. So once those decals have had a good 24 hours to fully cure, it's back on over to the spray booth, and this time it's for the clear coat, which once again I'm using Gravity Spain's 2K system, which is a 3:1:1 ratio. 3 parts clear, 1 part hardener or activator, and 1 part thinner. The first coat is just a basic tack coat. You're really not trying to lay down a lot of 2K, you just want a basic tack coat, what I like to call the shiny pebble dash coat, and that's really just there to make sure that there's a nice adhesive layer for the subsequent clear coats. So once again, we'll speed up the footage as we move into coat number 2. Make sure all those parts are completely covered in 2K. And of course the second coat is the first coat where you're going to put down a full wet coat. You can have a little bit of orange peel at this stage. It will level out, and the third coat you can use to basically finalize any of those issues. But basically you're trying to get a good clear glass-like coat at this stage. Set it aside for 10 to 15 minutes, and then come back in with your third and final coat. And basically at this stage what you see is what you're going to get. It will level out a little bit, but basically you want a perfectly clear gloss coat at this stage. And that seems to be what I've got at this stage. So that can be set aside for probably a minimum of 3 to 4 days. Usually I end up leaving them a couple of weeks, and that 2K will fully harden off. And we'll come back to that towards the end when we get to the polishing stage. So with that set aside, it's time to move on to working on the chassis, running gear parts. To remove all the parts you need from the sprue, begin cleaning them up. There's some minor seam lines to deal with. In around the shock absorber, I tend to find a file with a nice sharp edge on it. Like this half round one is good for getting into the crevices between the springs and knocking back any of the seam line. So once that prep work is done, it's back over to the spray booth, and once again it's the UMP white. So of course it's UMP white going down over a black plastic body. So you probably want about 4 coats of UMP white to get a good, nice, reasonably good coverage. This is not going to be a highly visible area anyway, so it's not to be too concerned about. Much of the running gear will all get primed in UMP black. Some of it will be left in UMP black because that's reasonably close to a semi-gloss black. And then a few parts like the suspension and exhaust will get separately painted as well. So on the chassis, because it's curbside, there is an engine block and drive shaft. These parts are brush painted. You could mask it all out, but because it's not highly visible, I just think use a paintbrush, carefully lay down the metallic colour you want for the engine block, painted the drive shaft black, and prop shaft rather, and what I assume is an extinguisher bottle that's painted red. So the brake discs, they were painted in Alclad steel. Once that was cured, and I'm going to spray some clear blue and some clear red over the central hubs of the discs to give them that anodized metallic finish. That also differentiates front and rear discs as well, which is quite useful for me to remember as well. So once that paint is cured, there are some PE discs to be added. So it's just a case of removing them from the PE sheet. A couple of tiny drops, tiny dabs of CA glue. And then carefully just drop that PE disc into place. Fit is spot on, and they look fantastic with the PE on them. So once that's complete, the suspension struts can be added, then the polycaps, and the actual brake discs. And that's basically the running gear. Very simple running gear. Looks all right on the underside. It's not going to be visible anyway. So that can be set aside, and it's now time to move on to working on the interior. So once again, get all your parts off the sprue, clean up any sprue attachments, clean up any seam lines. At this stage, I also like to try and assemble and glue the roll cage. Makes it a little bit easier to paint as one complete item. So you're just popping it in. You're not gluing it in place into the interior tub. You're just popping it in place. Transverse pieces are then added. It's one of these jobs where you need probably 2 or 3 pairs of hands to hold everything in place, and use some Tamiya Extra Thin mixed with EMA Plasti-Weld just to cure those transverse parts onto the side parts of the roll cage. So that can be set aside for a few minutes to cure. It's not glued into the tub, makes it much easier to paint. So once again, starting with UMP white primer. As you can see, the roll cage can now be fully primed, as of course can the interior tub. And because it's black plastic, once again, it's about 4 coats of UMP white to actually bring the proper depth of colour that you're actually looking for. So once that's complete, I'm going to add a couple of wiring harnesses just to dress up the interior a little bit, give it a little bit more interest to the eye. Also drop the part as well. As you can see, there's a PE handbrake's been added, the gear stick's been added, and then of course there's the seats. So they were primed in UMP black and are going to be left in UMP black. And it's a case of making up the seat belts and harnesses using the supplied PE parts in the detail upset for this kit. So plenty of nice little fiddly work with PE buckles. However, they do fit very well through the, well, a ribbon fits very well through the buckles. It's nicely sized. It's not a tight squeeze. Some careful manipulation with some various bits of tweezers and manipulation with, once again, those 4 pairs of hands that you need to hold stuff and manipulate it. But it's easy enough to work through. Just follow the instructions. Main thing to watch out for is just make sure you get your lengths pretty much correct. And don't forget, over the back of the seats, the back of the seatbelt harnesses will actually end up getting attached to the roll cage. So you want to make sure you leave a little bit of length for that to fit properly. So the lap belts and the crotch belts have a couple of PE parts, which a little bit of CA glue will glue them together. Then they can, of course, be glued in place on the seat. And as you can see, that is basically 2 sets of harnesses fully made up. There's a couple of seat decals to add and a couple of harness decals. And then once that's done, those seats can be added to the interior tub. Now, I think it's around this point I realise I'm building a left-hand drive car. Bertie Fisher's car had been converted to right-hand drive, but I was kind of so far into the build, it didn't seem practical to try and get a part made, try and find a right-hand drive dash. So I just went with it. And as you can see, the incorrect dash is now popped into the roll cage. Seats are in place. And it's just a case of securing the base of those harnesses back on it's either on the roll cage or the rear kind of internal chassis that they're glued to. So, interior is done. Chassis is done. It's time to go back to the body, which has been sat curing. It's time to flatten off any dust spots, flatten down the 2K a little bit. And that's done using some God Hand sanding sponges. I think I'm using 6, 8 and 10K. Because in fairness, this is one of the cleanest 2Ks I've got. Very few dust blemishes. So it's just a case of knocking back that 2K just a little bit, just to flatten it off a small bit. So after washing down the model to remove any sanding residues, time to move on to polishing stage. So I'm using the UMP polishing system, but I'm using an electric rotary tool with some sanding pads or polishing pads, which makes the process much, much quicker. So I tried it a long time ago on the Legacy, the Colin McRae Legacy, seemed to work quite well. Started trying it again, becoming increasingly pleased with the result. The results are as good as doing it by hand, but much, much quicker. I think in some areas it can be a little bit easier to go back over areas with micro scratches, but ultimately you do need to be very careful of any edges, very careful of any raised details, because you will basically burn through the paint very, very quickly. But however, on bigger, flatter surfaces, the machine polishing works absolutely fine. So, time to go back to the wheels. So they were primed in UMP black. I'm going to use Subaru Wheel Gold from Zero Paints for the base color. So 2 to 3 coats of that gold paint, and those wheels look absolutely spot on. Part of all the final painting work was also to mask and paint up all the windows. There was no mask supplied, so these were cut out individually for the front screen, rear screen, side windows, and then be very careful removing them with a blade like that. You don't want to scratch the clear parts. But once it's removed, you've got all your glass pieces prepped. You can then move on to some parts like the front grille, the iconic front grille of BMW, the double kidneys, the double headlights on each side as well. And that grille just pops into the front like so. Perfect fit. Almost no glue required. So now the final assembly can begin. The interior tub can be added to the chassis with a little bit of CA glue. And then the chassis and interior will slot straight into the bodywork. And the fit is absolutely fine. Again, it's just finding the right angle of manipulation just to slot it into the receiving slots for those parts. And it will just pop in just like so. So then, of course, the wheels that were painted, the tires can be popped on. Those wheels can then be added to the kit. So just checking to make sure they locate correctly. And then carefully push them into the brake discs and into the polycaps. And that, of course, is repeated on each corner of the car. Obviously, be a little bit careful on the front because there is movement in the steering at the front. And sometimes some of these suspension parts can be reasonably fragile. But it does all fit in. So for the exterior parts, I tend to use PVA based glue. So I'm using Deluxe Materials Glue and Glaze. So that's used for the rear spoiler. There's a couple of locating points, a couple of dots of glue and glaze. That's popped in place. And this M3 is beginning to look like the iconic M3 E30 that it is. And of course, front screen can also be added. Once again, I'm using glue and glaze. The fit is pretty good on the clear parts. They fit from the outside, but they fit pretty well. Sometimes Beemax and Nunu, you can have some bit of a fight with some of the clear parts because sometimes the 2K just makes the tolerances quite small. So as you can see, the screen just pops in place. And then additional details like wing mirrors, mud flaps, they can all be added. There is PE mud flaps in the detail upset, and they can just be CA glued in place. Again, just careful positioning. And then its final parts like the roof aerial. And it's basically at this stage that this kit can be declared finished. So although there was a couple of issues with the decals, didn't really notice it when they were going on in the first place, but certainly after the 2K you could see, particularly in any of the recessed areas, the decals didn't quite sit in as well as I wanted. But nonetheless, I'm absolutely delighted with how this kit has come out. I think the decals actually are pretty good, all things considered. There is no other option for this, but they do work. And this looks like Bertie's car from the 1990s. So let's head back to me for the final thoughts. Eventually. So there we go. That's the BMW M3 E30 from Beemax in 24th scale in the ToughMac scheme. So, as I mentioned, it was the first time using these decals from Angel Sergio. Don't get me wrong, the guy produces a lot of decal schemes. I would have said, you know, they're home printer quality, but obviously he does the work on the layout, so you have to say, you know, he's put in the effort, so credit to him for that. They're schemes that are not available elsewhere, so you got to go with it. But essentially, you know, they are printed on transparent decal film, so any color other than white is going to be difficult to do. That makes it a bit of a challenge for some other schemes, but for this one it kind of works because the car was white anyway. You can see the translucence in the decals when you actually release them from the paper initially, but obviously on the white background that doesn't make much of a difference. So the only issues I really had were there's a couple of areas along the kind of cheek of the car where the decal initially had sat in or appeared to sit in properly, and then once it's been dried 2K'd, it seems to have lifted away. That's not brilliant. You can always blame user error. It's the first time I used these decals, so I don't know how well they responded to certain decal solutions and heat, etc. And there was definitely at least one decal where it looked like the ink actually got somewhat attacked by, it could have been the 2K, it could have been something else. So there was definitely some blurring of the ink in the decal itself. So interesting experiment to see how they worked. I'm still really pleased with the outcome despite those minor issues. It's great to have one of my rallying heroes on the shelf. Bertie Fisher's M3 is sat next to Austin McHale's Manta 400 on my shelf as we speak. So two Irish tarmac rallying giants from many years ago. So I'm really pleased with the outcome. Really pleased how the build went. The M3 kit is awesome from Beemax. If you haven't built one, get one, do it. So I've got another 2 rally cars in the stash and a touring car of that M3 as well. So I've got a couple more of these to do at some point. So there we go. That's my build done. I think that's the video done as well. That's the video done. Yeah. So thank you all for watching. Thank you for your patience through the build of this kit. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like the video and feel free to leave a comment down below as well. So thank you all once again for watching. I'll see you all very soon. So bye for now.